So the office of sheriff really has the distinction of being the longest continuously existing non-military law enforcement entity. The history of the office, we can go back at least to the year 890 AD. So we're talking 1100, 1200 years ago. King Alfred was on the throne, and he wrote this document called the Book of Dooms. It sounds like some kind of modern-day video game or something, but really it was about crimes and punishments. In other words, if you commit this crime, if this is your offense, then this would be your doom, this would be your punishment that would go along with it. And in this Book of Dooms, he references a particular official, a particular official known as a reeve, R-E-E-V-E, kind of loosely translated as a guardian. And the reeve was the king's representative into a particular local area, a particular geographical jurisdiction. And the reeve was responsible for maintaining law and order and peace and safety within the community. They also did things like tax collection, mediated disputes. And they had the authority to call out something called the posse comitatus, which I'll talk about here in more detail in just a moment. And so these reeves were assigned to a geographical jurisdiction known as a shire. And we still have shires over there in England today, don't we? You got Devonshire, Lincolnshire, Worcestershire, if you need some steak sauce. And so the reeve was the king's representative assigned into a shire to do all of those things. So he was known as the reeve of the shire, or, got to get in line with my clicker here to hit the button. Okay, why is it not going now? There it goes. It's the shire reeve. And that's where we get the word sheriff from. So now you know that little bit of trivia. That could be the million-dollar question. You won't even have to call me for a lifeline. Now you'll know that where the term sheriff comes from. The term constable also has an interesting history. The constable was a quartermaster in the king's army, and he was known as a count of the stable. So now you know where that comes from. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we got the Norman Conquest. William of Normandy comes into England. King Harold is on the throne. King Harold is defeated, but William is so impressed by the tenacity, the courage, and the loyalty of the sheriffs that were there under King Harold's rule that he kept that office under his time of rule as well. And then we get, during this time, a list of duties. And it's interesting to me that the duties of the office of sheriff really haven't changed all that much in all these hundreds of years. Back during that era, the sheriff was responsible for representing the king. Now, I always like to say, well, we don't represent the king anymore. We represent somebody much more important than the king, because we represent you, the people, right, as your elected representative. And tax collection, believe it or not, there are sheriffs in certain states that still do this today. Louisiana is one of them, where the sheriff is responsible for collecting taxes. Now, I don't know how you do this, in all honesty. If you spend your time arresting people and collecting taxes, I don't know how you ever get reelected. You would think they would just have a bunch of single-term sheriffs, but they don't over there. Apprehending criminals on most wanted lists, assisting other sheriffs, operating jails. Most jails in America are operated by your local sheriff. Executions, they literally did that too. And not only the kind whereby you string somebody up from the tree or chop their head off with a guillotine or whatever else they may have done, we also execute orders of the court. We use that term today too. And as sheriffs, we are officers of the court. Again, we don't entertain royalty all that much. But the Magna Carta came out in 1215. Now, the Magna Carta was a really interesting document. For the first time ever in Western history, we have a constitutional document that is limiting the authority of the king. The nobles, and King John signed off on this same, but he was under duress by the nobles. The nobles really interposed themselves, and we're going to come back to that term, between the king and the people. And he said, you know what? The king's authority is not sovereign. The king's authority is not limitless. There are limitations even on the authority of the king. And in the 63 clauses of the Magna Carta, we find that 27 of them specifically refer to the office of sheriff. He was that important of an official under the king's rulership. And the Magna Carta was a document. Our founders looked to this many hundreds of years later in terms of coming up with our founding documents and this whole idea of constitutional limited government. We can trace the history back. I think I'm standing and getting blocked by some of the equipment here. So nowadays in England, the office of sheriff is still there, but it's pretty much kind of fallen into disuse. There's a weakening of the authority. It's much more ceremonial in nature. But think about this. When the colonists came over here and began to colonize America, they brought with them the common law of England, and they brought with them this office of sheriff. And in 1634, we have Captain William Stone being appointed as the first sheriff on American soil in Northamptonshire, Virginia. And then look at this, just a few years later in 1652. Folks, this is 120-something years before we declared our independence from Britain. What are we doing in America? We're electing our sheriffs. We are electing our government representatives because we understood the power and authority that was attached to that. The power comes from the people. Our founding documents are very clear, and then you then entrust and share and delegate that authority with these officials that you have elected. And then something really, really important happened in 1735 in the history of the office of sheriff. Sheriff John Nash was elected. Happens to be one of my ancestors. I did the family research on this, and I think he's my 8th or 9th great-grandfather on the Nash side was a sheriff. We also have some on the Rabin side. My Uncle Joe Rabin is in the audience, and we have some law enforcement officials there too. And then we've got a little bit of statistics here. There's over 3,000 sheriffs in America. Almost all of them are elected. There are some appointed sheriffs, believe it or not, but most all of them are elected, and by virtue of that are accountable back to you, the people. Now, as we began our western expansion, we of course took the office of sheriff with us into the Wild West, and you had some really colorful characters that were sheriffs during that era. You may not have known this. People like Wild Bill Hickok and Bat Masterson, and we mentioned Pat Garrett earlier. I came across this quote from a book called The American Sheriff. It said, not only did the sheriffs do regular things that you think of as sheriffs, but they did some unconventional types of punishment, including execution by choking. Can you imagine being the sheriff? You're out there fulfilling the order of the judge and choking the guy out into choking him to death. So anyway, I thought that was interesting.